Hi everyone, and welcome to Week 5 on Central and Eastern Europe. The Holocaust is, of course, our big case this week. But as we saw last week with regards to the Armenian genocide, our goal once again is to see the big picture. We start by looking at the structural preconditions for genocide involved with the collapse of the large dynastic empires after World War I and the subsequent turn to the nation-state. Next, the dramatic spike in genocidal violence is explained by the two rival imperial systems of the Nazis and the Soviets. After reviewing the litany of victims of Soviet mass violence, which was especially driven by Stalin's war against the countryside, we'll consider the possible synergy between the Nazi-Soviet joint project of disintegrating Poland as a country. By this point, we'll revert back to Holocaust historiography as we consider the evolution of the decision-making process behind the final solution, as well as how the Nazi genocide, or perhaps genocides against the Jews, intersected with other genocidal conflict. At the end, I'll recall some general observations on the Holocaust as an assault on Jewish motherhood. To begin, let's start by situating our readings this week as part of a larger body of historiography. Over the decades, there's been a ton of work done on comparing and contrasting the Nazis and the Soviets as totalitarian systems. Here's some more category. Our textbooks are part of this historiography as well. Once again this week, we follow Mark Levine's world historical approach, which is not concerned with examining one or two isolated cases in comparison with one another, but rather explores the extensive causal or contextual interconnections between different cases. To stress this point, I've shared this quote from Bloxham and Moses, who described this contextualist approach like viewing the landscape of a large mountain range, where we see the highest peaks above the cloud line. According to this metaphor, these are the biggest cases of genocide: the Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, Rwanda, etc. However, below the cloud line, these peaks are connected by foothills and valleys, as well as other smaller peaks that don't quite make it above our line of sight. Our contextualist approach takes in the entire landscape, not just what's above the cloud line. Levine's map of the rimlands is organized a bit differently in our syllabus, so whereas we covered zone number 2 last week, and we'll do zone number 1 next week, now we're ready to do zone 3. These are the political fault zones and the shifting tectonic plates of what Levine calls the European rimlands. If you recall from Levine's intro chapter in volume 1, he uses this geographical metaphor to explain the ruptures of major genocides. So, we're taking each of these fault zones just in a different order, but they each provide a unit of analysis, or a spatio-temporal, itself very well to examining the relationship between ostensibly separate episodes. As instructed by Levine, therefore, our analysis of the rimlands starts with the long-simmering crisis and eventual collapse of the large dynastic empires by the end of World War I. This was how the geopolitical map was organized before the Great War. Compare that with this map from today. As you can see, the geopolitical units have been replaced by new post-imperial nation-states. Many of these countries were formally recognized after World War I, which was an important turning point in the globalization of the nation-state, providing a link between earlier processes of nation-state formation in Western Europe, North America, and Latin America, as well as the subsequent diffusion of the nation-state in Asia and Africa during decolonization. Once again, we're concerned with the latent genocidal potential of the nation-state, been a general theme of the course thus far. However, as far as this specific region is concerned, we're faced with a paradox. The greatest peaks of genocide in the rimlands during World War II were not committed by any ordinary sort of nation-state. Rather, both the Nazis and the Soviets were imperialistic totalitarian regimes in the most extreme and ruthless ways conceivable. Yet, it's important to understand that the impetus for genocide, let alone its frequency, was not entirely dictated by these two superpowers. Rather, there were more general, systemic, dare say even indigenous forces at play, particularly with the spread of competing nationalisms. To use our earlier analogy, we mustn't focus entirely on the Soviet and Nazi cases as peaks above the cloud line. Again, we have to see the foothills and valleys between them, not to mention those hidden peaks below the cloud line. For example, over the course of modern history, there's been a simmering pattern of genocides between Poland and Ukraine. On the top left-hand side here, you see an image of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, a fiercely anti-Semitic Cossack Ukrainian leader who led a proto-nationalist rebellion in the mid-17th century against attacking Polish nobles and Catholic clergy. Khmelnytsky's followers also slaughtered thousands of Jews. Flash forward 300 years later, in the context of the World Wars, when the resurgence of Ukrainian nationalism was directed once again primarily at the Poles, but also the Jews. I'll mention the Ukrainian-Polish War during World War II a bit later, but the point here is how the anti-Jewish violence that so fundamentally defined this zone of genocide was inherently bound up with other conflicts. Likewise, to once again reiterate a key theme of our course, we see again how the unresolved legacies of past violence generate risk conditions for future violence. This deeper historical context is especially relevant when we consider how the waves of anti-Jewish pogroms during the late 19th and early 20th century in Western Tsarist Russia later became the epicenter of the Holocaust. This wasn't just a coincidence. In many ways, the mass violence of earlier periods established a precedent that would come back to haunt. The red line on this map indicates the boundaries of the so-called Pale of Settlement. After the Polish partitions in the late 18th century, around 1 million Polish Jews became subjects of the Russian Empire and were restricted to these western provinces. Over the following century, there was rapid population growth across the entire region, putting strain on resources at a time when Eastern Europe was part of the semi-peripheral economy, meaning that its agricultural output was directed towards foreign markets. This resulted in underdevelopment. These strains were concurrent with the rise of mass politics, especially in the forms of anarchism and revolutionary socialism, which in turn led to harsh government crackdowns that were also designed to snuff out any nationalist independence movements that threatened the stability of the empire. This was the context for the wave of anti-Jewish pogroms in the late 19th century. Starting with the pogroms of 1881-82, this first wave was precipitated by the assassination of Tsar Alexander II by a revolutionary surprise, surprise, it was of course blamed on the Jews. A second wave followed the First Russian Revolution in 1905, which, again, was blamed on the Jews. You see a pattern here, which once again played itself out in the third wave of pogroms following the February and October revolutions of 1917. We'll focus more on this latter context. We see a peak of genocidal violence in the Eastern European rimlands in the immediate aftermath of World War I. So let's take a step back and take in the larger structural dynamics at work during this context. We've already reviewed how the large dynastic empires of the region all collapsed as a result of World War I and were replaced by new nation-states. Leading the way in this transformation was Poland, which once again became a member of the international community after being partitioned over a century earlier. Yet, as we've seen elsewhere, the process of nation-state formation led to the sudden creation of the so-called minorities problem, in which this problem could be quote-unquote solved. First, Poland and the other new countries in Eastern Europe were compelled to sign minority rights treaties under the supervision of the League of Nations. Now, this idea may have been good in principle, but in practice it was a dismal failure, eventually being co-opted by the Nazis during the Anschluss. Yet there were namely bilateral population transfers, or the forced removals of peoples. We saw a bit of that last week, with a quote-unquote transfer of Circassians from Russia to the Ottoman Empire. Another more contemporaneous example was the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne, that provided for an exchange of populations between Greece and the newly established post-Ottoman country of Turkey. As we'll see, this solution was ultimately favored during the brief Nazi-Soviet alliance and the disintegration of Poland in 1939. There was, of course, a third way of solving the problem, and that was through mass murder, which, for a few years after World War I, became increasingly common, wild, lawless violence that was endemic to the entire Shatter Zone region. Post-war anti-Jewish violence reached their heights in the contested eastern borderlands of the new Polish state, where there was an aborted attempt for Ukrainian independence. By the end of the Polish Bolshevik War of 1920, as many as 60 to 150,000 Jews had, mostly as a result of irregular warfare by heavily armed, non-state militants, including roving bands of White Army fighters, disbanding after their defeat to the Red Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War. It was in this context that the so-called Zytokomuna myth of Jewish Bolshevism found fertile ground and spread across Europe. As White Russians and the new anti-Bolshevik states like Poland, not to mention the defeated Germans, all blamed the Jews for the international menace of communism. With that said, let's now turn to the Soviet Union, where the success of the October Revolution in 19 did not lead to a global revolution, as expected by Leninist orthodoxy. On the contrary, the Bolshevik regime was hanging on for dear life at first, as post-World War I Russia and Eastern Europe descended into a complex, multilateral war zone. In this context, the Bolsheviks had to fight for survival in a competitive Darwinian international system. As the regime secured its hold, it embarked upon an aggressive program of developmentalism that was infused with a strong dose of paranoia, directed both outwards in terms of world politics and inwards at home in Russia. On the one hand, the Bolsheviks looked fearfully outwards at the Western communism would be attacked and extinguished before it could reach its necessary military-industrial takeoff. On the other hand, the regime looked equally fearfully inwards at the supposedly dangerous internal subversives, or fifth columnists, who were perceived to be proxies of the Western enemy. This was especially the case with the kulaks, which was an entirely constructed category. In Russian, the word means fist, and it was used as a pejorative for the small rural middle class, i.e., those peasants who owned their own property, which of course was antithetical to Marxist orthodoxy, and thus needed to be smashed and obliterated by the iron fist of the state. As Mark Levine notes, there was a pronounced psychological gulf between the rural peasants and the mostly urban Bolsheviks. Stalin and his cadre were especially paranoid that the kulaks were dangerous subversive elements who threatened to once again withhold, as they supposedly had done during the Russian Civil War and the concurrent Polish-Soviet War, when the Bolshevik regime was trying to implement an economic policy known as war communism. There was, however, a brief interlude of peace during the mid-1920s, during which time the Soviet Union adopted what was known as the New Economic Policy, which allowed for some limited degree of private enterprise. Although after the Soviet war scare of 1926, when Stalin thought the West was going to use Poland to invade Russia, the Bolsheviks reverted back to the war communism model. In 1929, Stalin announced an all-out, state-enforced policy of liquidation. Over the following year and a half, the Soviet secret police and the rest of the machinery of the state set in motion a radical program of social engineering, forcibly removing nearly 2 million people to Siberia, the Urals, and Kazakhstan. And although the kulaks were an imaginary category, they were dealt with as an organic entity, literally in the sense that entire family units were targeted for removal. Moreover, the intent to destroy the kulaks as a socio-economic class was marked by the logic of preemption as a means for the perpetrator regime to achieve a sense of permanent security. As noted above, Stalin's war on the countryside was marked by the perpetrator's never-again syndrome. Stalin's aggressive developmentalist agenda, with its fast-paced, large-scale overhaul of society and economy, contained an inbuilt dynamic towards genocide based on mostly imaginary enemies of the people. You may recall this slide from week 1 of Underpinnings, where I direct your attention towards the right side of the spectrum, as the Stalinist approach to genocide was marked by a flexible, mutable, and fungible way of targeting outgroups. As far as the conceptual debate over genocide, this reflects the idea of understanding the genos as a social construct. Anyways, Stalin's paranoia about grain supplies translated into a pattern of recurring famines. Mind you, the problem of famines isn't always due to crop failures or some other environmental cause. Rather, mass famines are almost always a problem of distribution. We'll talk more about this in week 7 in the context of British colonial rule in India. In this case, the reality of the so-called Great Famine of 1932-33 was absolutely denied by Stalin, as the regime was not about to admit that their policy of collectivization was responsible for producing widespread starvation in the countryside. No, given Stalin's paranoia, the result of internal subversives. Remember, Stalin was waging a war against the countryside. The Great Famine wasn't an accident. It was a concerted, systematic, military-induced famine. Moreover, it wasn't a coincidence that the Great Famine most affected these geopolitically sensitive borderland regions. In particular, Stalin was determined to prevent an independent, Polish-sponsored Ukraine. In this sense, the so-called Holodomor was a function of animus directed in terms of both class and nation. This brings us to the Nazi-Soviet pact on the eve of World War II, where Hitler and Stalin agreed to partition Poland yet between these two competing regimes that both conspired to disintegrate the Polish nation-state. For the Soviets, their conquest of Poland was in many respects a continuation of state security policies since 1935, when they began mass deportations from the Soviet Union's border areas. Prior to 1939, these borderland cleansing operations were directed at ethnic Germans, Finns, and many others, including the Koreans in the Far East. With the conquest of Poland, Ukraine, and Belarusia, the repressive policies that had been widely tested on Soviet society were exported for the first time. Quite simply, they aimed to decapitate at least some 25,000 Polish citizens were executed by the NKVD, or the Soviet secret police. Another 100,000 or so were arrested and detained, and as many as 1.25 million Poles were deported. Meanwhile, just as the NKVD was orchestrating a Polish eliticide in the east, Reinhard Heydrich's SD was doing the same in the west. Indeed, Levine suggests, and I haven't been able to confirm this, that the NKVD and the SS liaised and shared information in order to obliterate Polish resistance during these early months of the war. It is very much true, however, that there was a close degree of coordination between these two regimes regarding the transfer of the Volksreich from Russia to Germany, an operation very much in the vein of the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne. Resettling these ethnic Germans was a priority of Nazi population policies from 1939 to 1940. This was the goal of a series of short-range resettlement plans, the removal of ethnic Poles and Jews, particularly in the annexed territory of the Warthgau, in order to make way for incoming Germans from the east. Okay, I'm going to breeze through the following slides, as we're covering content that's addressed well enough by other courses in our curriculum. This slide here is based on a 1992 article by Ian Kershaw, which you can find in the supplemental reading, which was one of the 3 areas of Western Poland annexed to the German Reich after September 1939. And he provides a masterful account of the genesis of the final solution, which he argues unfolded in a haphazard and piecemeal fashion, instigated by local initiatives of regional Nazi bosses, improvised as a largely ad hoc response to the logistical difficulties of a Jewish problem they had created for themselves, and only gradually congealing into a full-scale program for genocide. Faced with the logistical logjam of repatriating incoming ethnic Germans, but having nowhere to dump the Jews, the Nazis had backed themselves into a cul-de-sac. Out. This is a moderate functionalist analysis that points to the crucial dynamic between central and peripheral figures in the perpetrator bloc. Next, there's a 2003 book chapter by Robert Gallatley, who offers the notion of serial genocides to help unravel the multiple victim groups of Nazis without decentering the Holocaust. He shows how anti-Jewish persecution from 1933 to 1939 evolved incrementally, as well as how the outbreak of war was a major turning point in the process of cumulative radicalization. By drawing from this seminal work by Henry Friedlander, Gallatley also discusses the Nazi euthanasia campaign as a crucial prelude to the use of gas in crematoria, and the software in terms of the rationale and thought process used to murder, both of which would soon be adopted to the final solution. Thus we see how one genocide was closely related to another, hence the concept serial genocides. Towards the end of the essay, Gallatley suggests that the genocide against the European Jews occurred alongside other potential genocides. Now, I don't want to get bogged down by the definitional debate over whether or not the Nazi persecution of the Slavs meets whatever threshold one might have for the G word. In contrast to Gallatley, the broad approach to conceptualizing genocide that I follow dispenses with the sides. I disagree with his conclusion that the disintegration of the Polish nation, for example, was an unrealized genocide. But that's beside the point. Rather, the point is to understand how the Holocaust was wrapped up in other genocidal conflicts. Indeed, there's a growing body of scholarship that attempts to unravel the entwined genocides of World War II by turning to the local or regional level of analysis. By utilizing a geographical approach, we can not only see that the Holocaust was a conglomeration of multiple events and processes, but we can also unravel the entwined genocides that coincided with the destruction of the European Jews. Next week, we'll discuss the war of all against all in Yugoslavia during World War II. Likewise, I alluded earlier to the brutal Polish-Ukrainian conflict during the war as well. I'll need to expand on this the next time I teach this course. Likewise, there's much more to say about the Holocaust and gender. This slide draws from an essay by Doris Bergen, whose work in many ways was later advanced by Eliza von Joden-Forgey's concept of life force atrocities. Like the Gallatley piece, Bergen tries to make a distinction between Jewish and Slavic victims, a distinction that I think is a bit unclear. On the one hand, she argues that dehumanization was a primary function of sexual violence against Jewish women targeted for annihilation. To borrow from the life force atrocities concept, the ritualistic desecration of Jewish victims stripped them of their dignity and sense of humanity, thereby making it easier for the perpetrators to kill them. This, by the way, recalls our reading by David Patterson in Week 1 of Underpinnings on the Nazi assault on Jewish motherhood. As far as Bergen's argument is concerned, so far so good. On the other hand, however, Bergen also argues that for those targeted groups on the other side of the Nazis' genocidal divide, sexual violence served a related but different function, which she argues was to demean people as members of a community, to destroy ties among them. And first of all, the assumption, once again following Galatly, is that Slavic victims did not really suffer genocide. Secondly, the implication is that sexual violence against Slavic victims did not dehumanize them, and that, conversely, sexual violence against Jewish victims did not demean them and destroy communal bonds. This, I think, is a false distinction. Certainly there was a difference in the Nazi racial hierarchy between Jews and Slavs, so it makes sense that there would be different functions of sexual violence. But how should we make this distinction? More research on this is necessary. Finally, the next time I teach this course, I want to add content on the post from Central and Eastern Europe after the war, as it represents an important strand of continuity concerning population transfers as a technology of social engineering. But we're running out of time and I need to wrap up. As usual, we have our next steps, so not much new to report here. I'll just say a couple of things. First, as far as the analytical essay assignment is concerned, you don't need to include outside sources. I'm primarily interested in your own thoughts. Second, regarding the case study, I just want to reiterate that you need to follow the 14-part rubric that's included in the syllabus. See the examples I sent last week.